Hello, I'm Terry Cohan-Link, principal of LINKCO. Welcome. Good afternoon and good evening for those of you joining us from Europe. Please let me know in the Q&A box if you can hear and see me, and let me know where you are based. Let's see what people are saying. Is the Q&A box working? Open questions. Okay. Okay, DC, we've got somebody, Murietta, we've got somebody from Jerusalem, we've got somebody from Oregon, California. Thank you for letting me know you can hear us. Appreciate you attending today. Thank you for attending the webinar, Leading with Resilience and Agility in the COVID-19 era, a fireside chat featuring Randi Braun, founder of Something Major. I will introduce Randi in just a few minutes. This webinar is part of a series born out of insights shared by business leaders during conversations about the current COVID-19 business climate. The conversations resulted in a timely white paper entitled Resilient Realism, which LINKCO published about 2 weeks ago. Each respondent shared lessons learned, insights, and every conversation resulted in identifiable business opportunities based on the particular realities faced by the leader interviewed. In the wake of COVID-19, many of the respondents have been grappling with a freshly remote workforce, new challenges of workflow and timetables, evaluation of materials produced, cybersecurity and privacy from off-site locations, how to lead remotely with loved ones sharing workspace, and unanticipated demands on normal work time and ditto for employees, to name but a few of the disruptors and challenges discussed in the white paper. Our topic is extremely timely, as the last several weeks have laser-focused worldwide attention on issues of institutional and societal racism and economic injustice, with Mr. George Floyd's tragic death weighing on our nation and the world. As human beings and as business leaders, our responses impact our businesses, our employees, and our communities. Many of the respondents to the white paper asked questions and shared concerns regarding agile and resilient leadership and company culture cohesiveness due to rolling shelter-in-place requirements, a newly remote workforce, recessionary and pandemic fears. How do we manage when much of the previous separation between work and home no longer exists? What is the new normal going to look like, and how do we approach the new normal? That is the impetus for the webinar today. This is my way of giving back and sharing relevant information I learned speaking with business leaders on a day-to-day basis as part of my ongoing executive search practice. In this case, I gained permission to anonymously share what business leaders are facing and envisioning going forward, and crafted these insights into the white paper. And if you want to receive a copy, just let me know in the Q&A box, and I'll send it to you via email. I'm currently working on scheduling more webinars based on feedback I receive from attendees like you. So do give me feedback when I reach out for a postmortem. The upcoming webinar in this series will be on June 24th, same time, with Thomas O'Brien, Executive Director, Center for International Trade and Transportation, METTRANS Transportation Center, entitled Resilient Supply Chains and Transportation in the Wake of COVID-19. A little housekeeping. Some of you have generously shared your questions beforehand. You may also send questions in the Q&A box, which I'll monitor. And if not covered already, we will try to work them into our session today. Now let me introduce our amazing speaker. Specializing with women leaders, Randi Braun is an executive coach, consultant, speaker, and the founder of Something Major. She has coached leaders across the Fortune 500, financial services and real estate investment firms, law firms, startups, nonprofits, and trade associations. A thought leader who has been featured in Forbes, The Washington Post, and Parents Magazine, Randi speaks frequently on topics of women's professional development and leadership, business development, thriving in the working parenthood, and building meaningful professional relationships. She has spoken at organizations including Uber, the Embassy of Canada, UCLA's Anderson School of Management, and the National Association of Manufacturers. Prior to founding Something Major, Randi was a fundraising turned business development executive. As a sales leader, Randi generated tens of millions of dollars for a diverse portfolio of organizations, including nonprofits, publicly traded and privately held companies, and tech startups. Randi, tell us a little more about your work and how you work with executives, please.
Well, good afternoon, Terry. I guess good evening here for my fellow Washingtonian on the line. I am broadcasting live from my home down here in downtown Washington, D.C. So for our Washingtonian, would love to know where you are in Washington. Feel free to throw that into the Q&A. I think I can see that. It's a pleasure to meet you all. If you heard my bio and you're sitting here thinking this woman specializes working with women, don't worry, I work with a lot of men too. As Terry mentioned, I coach, I consult, I speak. I really work with leaders to help them lead on purpose. So what that means is really helping them think about what are their core values, crystallizing their goals, and then scaling and aligning those across every element of their professional and personal world to amplify their impact and really help build a life that's not just thriving professionally, but really full of personal fulfillment. I also work with a lot of organizations to build programs that support women and working parents, which has been more urgent than ever in a COVID-19 world, and have been working with a very big tech company to help support their efforts there. But really just looking forward to having a conversation with you all. A lot of my clients, they come from sectors like healthcare and manufacturing and have really been at the vanguard of dealing with COVID-19 in February in a way that a lot of us didn't really start dealing with until March. So happy to share some lessons learned from my coaching practice, and really looking forward to engaging with you all on your questions as well.
Thank you for that. Our topics for today are agility and resiliency. How do you define those?
Absolutely. So I love Angela Duckworth's definition of resilience. Many of you probably read Grit, which I call the Resilience Bible. It's really what put the idea of resilience on the corporate map in a very mainstream way. And you know, the way that Angela Duckworth describes it is the ability to bounce back when you have struggled, failed, or faltered. You know, Terry, to your point about how timely our conversation is, I can hardly think of an organization that hasn't struggled in a COVID-19 world and moment. Even, you know, as I said to one of my clients the other day, there are winners and losers here, and nobody wants to win in this world, so to speak. But even for companies that COVID-19 is actually generating revenue for them, just given the nature of their work, it's still a struggle to realign and to scale. A lot of companies aren't so lucky, and that's a different struggle. If resilience is a state of being, I say agility is a state of doing. So it's how you bounce back. It's how you pivot. It's how you are able to really move through the world with a really clear idea of what your values are and real confidence in what you need to do to achieve your goals, especially when circumstances change. Though I would welcome, you know, our participants' views on these as well. So.
Okay, thank you. One of the questions that came up about this is the following. If leaders are to change their mindset on resilience, what top 3 things should they be considering first? And of those top 3, for those top 3 to be realized and acted upon, what actually needs to happen for impacts to be felt?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just talking to one of my organizational partners about this yesterday. They're a large national trade association here in Washington, D.C. And the truth is, like I just said before, every organization is experiencing resilience in its own way. Some are doing a better job than others. One of the things I was talking about with this partner yesterday was just the importance of communication in this moment. Everybody is struggling right now. A lot of people are doing great and innovative things. You're seeing some companies really rise to the occasion. Just look at what's happening in the healthcare industry. For example, I work with a large national health insurance company, and for years they've been slowly slogging towards progress with telemedicine initiatives. And suddenly in a COVID-19 world, right, their resilience was being able to, they faltered. They weren't able to serve all of the clients who they serve in their typical mode of service. They were able to use that agility to really bounce back and bring telemedicine to the forefront for their population in a way they hadn't been able to do in 10 years since they had started these initiatives. So there's a lot of opportunity here to innovate, Terry. There's also a lot of opportunity to communicate and build trust with your team. So this trade association that I mentioned, they hadn't actually communicated with their team in a way to say, we know these are really difficult and challenging times. Like, they said it at the beginning, and now we're going on 3 months in, and really hadn't reiterated that message. And so what that happens is it makes your employees question how resilient you are. They want to know that you know that people are struggling, and they don't expect you to have all of the answers, but just that power of acknowledging the elephant in the room, even when you don't have the answers, goes such a long way towards building trust. And that trust is something that really makes employees feel like your organization is resilient. So it's really a virtuous cycle in terms of your actions as a leader and how the people in your organization feel them.
So there's a follow-up question, and then it touches on actually the next question. So with this discussion around change and changing things for the better through taking a realistic general viewpoint, many people don't really like change. How do leaders adapt and instill mentality that agility is positive for their culture and for them and their workforce practice?
Yeah, change and agility they're two different things, and they're both a little bit tricky. Change gets people really, really nervous, right? We put a lot of effort into our work. We put a lot of effort into our relationships, our projects, our portfolios. We spend all this time at work. And so when things change, people naturally get very apprehensive. Am I going to lose control of a project that I've always loved? Will a reorg align me with people who I either have conflict with? Will I leave that reorg diminished in some way? It's very, very natural for people to get nervous about change. And it's really, again, all about the communication and the messaging. It's the number one thing that organizations can do right now to really be resilient and agile is no matter what you're doing in your war rooms at the C-level and the executive level, unless your people hear from you and hear what it is that you're doing, what it is that your goals are, why the change is happening, really taking the time to enfranchise them. Yeah, there's going to be hard decisions that are made, no doubt. In a lot of companies, there's furloughs and pay cuts and job cuts. But communication is so essential, again, for really using this opportunity to not just be resilient, not just be agile, but truly build up trust and loyalty and engagement from your people. There are a lot of great examples of companies that are really investing in this right now. And I think they're going to come out on the other side, Terry, with really strong retention on the other side of this. And just really, really strong loyalty. It's a real moment to be able to show up for people and really make them feel like you have their back.
Very, very helpful. Thank you. Right now, we're having a national conversation about race in organizations, and you touched on that a little bit earlier. What can we do in addition to what you've already mentioned to address these issues, and how are they related to resilience and equity?
Yeah, last week, Terry and you and I could barely find time to sync up. Last week, my phone was ringing off the hook from all the leaders that I coach, just really needing support in how they can lead through this. And I will share with you, Terry, and everyone else who's joining us today or watching the recording, what I shared with my clients, the executive leaders that I work with last week, which is that I am not a subject matter expert on racial justice and racial equity. My first piece of advice is to not just build a strategy, which we'll talk a little bit about, but to build a team of people who are. This is the time to bring in subject matter experts to really, really help steward this. And we all have to be prepared here, is what I shared with my leaders that I worked with last week, to play the long game here. This is a systemic issue that has plagued the United States. It is the original sin of this country. We are talking about 400 years of systemic inequity. And we are not going to fix the problem with a Black Lives Matter graphic. We're not going to fix the problem in a month or even a year. And so my pieces of advice for the leaders who are thinking about this seriously are twofold. Number one, how do you want to show up for people right now? And then how do you want to steward a strategy? A lot of companies, and it's not too late if you didn't do this last week, have actually given their employees space to say, we're going to offer some flex PTO days. It's like, if for those of you, I know we have one Washingtonian who know this term from the government, we're going to do some liberal leave. You have permission for the next 2 weeks to take vacation within reason. You don't have to explain why, because there are a lot of people who are grieving and mourning right now, and this feels really personal for them. From a strategic point of view, a few things that I want to hit. Again, I highly recommend getting your war room together with a best-in-class diversity, equity, and inclusion expert and being willing to put some budget dollars behind this. Comcast was really a leader here. They just rolled out a multi-year $100 million plan to address this. We're gonna need to have sustained attention and effort here. And the last thing I wanna urge people to do is to make sure, if you are not a person of color, if you're not African American, take this as an opportunity to do more listening and less talking. And be conscientious as you're doing that listening to not charge people what they call the diversity tax. So if you're not familiar with that term, it's a term that people in the diversity, equity, and inclusion community use. It's essentially taxing people by taking them away from their work and draining them emotionally to explain to you as a white person about the systemic issues and their life experiences. You can create the space for those conversations, but it is not their job to tax themselves with educating you. So there's an opportunity to enfranchise without taxing.
Thank you for those good recommendations. There's a crisis within a crisis that we're noting with mental health. And we haven't had any business-wide real mental health discussions previous to COVID-19. Burnout seems to be more and more of a problem. What's the best way to institute healthy processes on a going forward basis? How do companies put well-being forward?
It's such an important question and conversation. And I was just talking about this with a friend and a colleague of mine. Her name's Elise Cohen. She just shared a lot of her insights a few weeks ago in a great article that went viral from Bloomberg about the mental health crisis and how organizations are responding. Terry, we can get a copy and share that to everybody, certainly in follow-up. And what Elise does is she manages all of the wellness initiatives for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation here at the Chamber's HQ in Washington. And we were just having a conversation about this. We do a lot of work together in terms of shared conversations and topic areas. And, you know, it's kind of this last piece of the wellness puzzle that most organizations have not touched, right? A lot of organizations, they'll give you a stipend to buy a Peloton. They'll give you a stipend for a swanky membership at Equinox, or even give employees the benefits of fitness hours and best-in-class healthcare benefits. But mental health has been scary. Mental health has had a stigma. And what COVID has done is really thrust this into the mainstream, right? It's just something that cannot be ignored anymore because we have people isolated. And it's a huge issue for anyone who's not just suffered from traditional mental health issues of anxiety and depression. We're talking about addiction, eating disorders, and even just being triggering for too much stress. So what I'm recommending for the leaders that I work with is really helping them architect how can you build a work world and a work culture at your organization right now where people are still rising to the occasion, expectations are still high, but you create some normalcy around the fact that this is hard, this is abnormal. And there are lots of benefits that companies can do. Everything from revisiting how they're funding and creating actual benefit structures for mental health and wellness initiatives, to giving more kind of floating resources and floating days off, as well as bringing in not just therapists and counselors, which I've seen some companies do, but also thinking about how you engage with coaches. You know, it's really easy to bring in a professional coach. And again, it doesn't have to be someone like me. There's lots of coaches out there to really create a space so that your employees can have a one-on-one individualized conversation to think about how they're going to scale and sustain. I wrote about this, Terry, back in early April. And I said this was the #1 thing that I was watching was burnout. We're now in June, and I can tell you it is the #1 conversation I'm having behind closed doors. So I'm part of a founders collective, mostly based of San Francisco, Silicon Valley founders. And we just had our quarterly meeting. This was, of the 100 women founders on the call, the #1 topic on how they were managing burnout at the C-level and how they were trying to help their teams. And really what you all can do at the executive level is model some of this behavior. So whether that is putting on your out of office responder and taking a PTO day. We have one technology company here in the DC region that's really well known here in the ed tech space. And they've instituted a spring break and then a summer vacation. So every quarter that we have COVID, they're closing the office for 3 additional days on a holiday weekend to give their staff the time to recharge. So I could go on and on about wellness and self-care. I'm gonna pause there. It's something I'm really, really passionate about and would welcome more engagement and conversation on that, Terry, in the Q&A. I don't wanna gobble up all of our time on this topic.
Great, and I'll just encourage everyone, as you think of questions, please type them into the Q&A, and I keep checking, and hopefully we'll be able to get to them. I'm gonna go on in the meantime so we can cover kind of a broad array, and then we'll come back to some of these as the questions start. So another crisis within this crisis has been the lack of childcare for working parents. What are the steps companies can take to better assist mothers during COVID-19? What are the reasonable expectations during COVID-19, particularly during shelter in place and while schools and daycares are not open, regarding work responsibilities of employees?
Yeah, and it's truly a crisis. And, you know, Terry, one of the #1 things that companies can do is think about this as a working parents issue, not just as a working mom's issue. Right. Because we have moms and dads who are sharing care. We have single family homes, we have divorced homes that are co-parenting. And so the #1 thing I will offer, you know, our executives who have joined us today is to think about, there is nothing monolithic about your population of working parents. I think what COVID-19, Terry, has taught us is that we don't know anything about what happens when people go home from work.
Yeah.
Right? And this is just really magnified that we used to have this persona in the office and then we would go home. Well, now suddenly when home is office and office is home, you know, I had one woman I work with, she's a ascendant partner track attorney at a very prominent law firm here in Washington. And she has an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old. And she said, most of my clients and colleagues don't even know I'm a mom. And I have carefully crafted my reputation so that I never miss out on a business trip, a client matter, a conference, because of a doctor's appointment. And so this is really a struggle for your working parents because most of them have spent years, maybe some of you are parents yourself, architecting how they want their life to look so that they can do their work and love and run their family and their household. And it just disappeared with no warning. And what I can tell you is that working parents are struggling. Many are surviving and far from thriving. You know, Terry, Fortune reported that 14% of women have considered dropping out of the workforce since the pandemic began. And the research shows us that that is almost exclusively because working mothers can hardly carry the burden. And so again, a few things that I recommend you doing, and I've been working with a big tech company out on the West Coast to help them really think about how they're supporting their working parents during this time. So without sharing anything proprietary about the work that I'm doing there, I'll share just a few best practices about how a company that you read about every day in the newspaper is handling this. And it hasn't been something that they publicize, but #1, they're buckling up for a long-term event. So they're really, even though they have not publicly messaged this, you know, they're really buckling up that like this is a very, very long-term event, and they're making contingency plans with the idea that parents are going to be home with their kids in perpetuity. That's number one. Number two is they are resourcing their parents up. So whether that's giving them additional mental health benefits and giving them not just additional resources around therapy and employee assistance programs, but coaches. They're doing a lot of workshops, a lot of facilitation, a lot of one-on-one coaching. And these are going to be acute engagements, right? These aren't going to be a coach comes in and embeds for years. These are going to be for the next few months. They have access to coaches. Another company here, Terry, that I work with is thinking about how they use budget dollars to do really easy things, which is give Uber Eats credits to their working parents. Just give them one less thing to worry about. You know, the top line thing is really your working parents cannot work the same way they did before. And even if some of you are saying, well, I'm a working parent, I know it's different, but what I will say is I'm also seeing a tiered effect. So at the C level, the demands are unlike any other, but by nature of being the boss, you don't have as much pressure around the perception as a working parent. What I see for really ascendant middle managers, everywhere from the director to the EVP level, and that is a big spread, there's a lot of anxiety around, will I get that huge raise that I was gunning for? Will I get that promotion I've been working 3 years on? And so also recalibrating some of your performance metrics is going to be a really, really worthwhile exercise. Though Terry, working parents, that could be a whole nother hour-long conversation.
Yeah, no, that's great suggestions and a lot of thought-provoking ideas. Thank you so much. And we may come back to it depending on follow-up questions. And so that touches on how do we manage the work-life boundaries in this new COVID-19 environment?
It's the hardest thing, and I would welcome people, you know, if you want to share in the Q&A something that's been a struggle for you or something that's worked for you. I always love crowdsourcing this. I can give you a few best practices. And really, it's such a different work world for us. Again, this actually is my home office, but it's totally different because now I share it with my husband and I only get to be out here for a few hours a day. But you know, it's really hard because days become nights, nights become days, work weeks become weekends. And it's just, everything's really blurred. It's really, really hard to create the boundaries. And part of the issue is that even if it was little small things, Terry, the way we used to fix our first cup of coffee in the morning, the way that we would commute, even if we hated our commute. And I work with one executive leader. She's one of the leaders of a large professional services and financial services firm in New York. She hated her commute from the suburbs 2 hours into Manhattan. But it was kind of part of the ritual of her day that gave boundaries between when work was beginning and ending. Sure. That gave her time to recalibrate, to catch up, to have quiet time, to squeeze in the types of calls that she just couldn't get in during billable hours times during the day. And so what I really invite you all to do is think about how can you reclaim time and agency and create boundaries on your calendar by reclaiming little rituals. So I work with a CEO down here in Washington, and for her, this has been a real struggle for her. Her husband and her are now working from home. Her office is closed. Her son is home with them. And so it's counterintuitive, Terry, but one of the first things that she does is her workday ritual starts by actually leaving her house and taking a walk around the block. Yeah. She just needs to have like some separation and segmentation around the day. And then her wind down ritual is she will actually put her computer in a drawer, like actually away in a drawer, which by the way, I started doing because I loved it. I loved that she had designed that. And she will build a 2 to 3 song playlist the night before for what that morning walk is going to look like for her. So it's so small. Those things take a collective 15 minutes, but they've really been a game changer in making her feel like she's starting work, she's ending the day. It's the little things. Terry, the last thing I would say is that it's really helpful to take time on your calendar and do time blocking exercises. So I work with an executive at a Fortune 200 company. And when I first told her this idea, she was like, that's crazy. Like I'm needed in too many places. I couldn't possibly time block my calendar. And yeah, her role requires a lot of agility. She's a C-level executive at a Fortune 200 company, no doubt. And so we said, okay, let's start 3 weeks in advance. Let's say everything on your calendar now doesn't change, doesn't move. Let's start planning this for next month. And so what we did was we gave her 60 minutes at the beginning of the day, 60 minutes at the end of the day, and that was sacrosanct work time. Unless it was a true war room emergency situation, that did not change. She blocked in her meal times, and we also blocked in for her what I call agility blocks, Terry. So, you know, the emergency meeting is going to happen, and you can't say, you know, Terry, thank you for convening the emergency meeting. Unfortunately, you called this for 1, and my agility block for unplanned matters is actually from 2:30 to 4. So do you mind if we move it? The idea of having agility blocks and all these calendar blocks is not that you follow it to, you know, to every dot, every I, and cross every T. It's so that you can kind of, it's like blocks, you can like plug and play like Legos. And so what happened is if your emergency meeting comes up at 1, you can move your 1 to 2 during the agility block, and it just gives you a little bit of a release valve so that you can still get everything done-ish in the work day without making this an 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock night every single day, every single night.
And that segues perfectly into the next question, which is, what can companies do to better help with the working from home fatigue? And what do you think that working from home culture is here to stay?
Super interesting questions. Again, so much at being at the C-level is really modeling this. And so most of the executives that I work with, they are firing on all cylinders. They're making some of the toughest calls of their entire careers. And even if they went to Harvard Business School or Kellogg, or they've been in the role for 20 years, there is nothing in their education or their work experience that prepared them for this moment. And yet everything in their experience in life prepared them for this moment. And so the hours are long. I wish I could do more to change that. I wish that we had more reprieves than just, you know, taking walks and making that time for self-care. But a few of the things that help with the work from home fatigue are thinking about, if you haven't taken a day off in this COVID-19 world, I do encourage you to think about reimagining a summer staycation for yourself. There's a reason, Terry, why we get our best ideas when we're washing our hair in the shower, when we're walking the dog at 10:30 at night, when we're laying in bed and we can't sleep and we get that idea in our head. And it's because slowing down and creating those boundaries and those spaces for pause helps us. And so giving yourself opportunities to re-energize is going to help with that fatigue, as are creating rituals, as are creating boundaries. And the more your people see that, that's going to help. Another tactic, Terry, that I'll offer to our executives here today is thinking about not contributing to meeting fatigue. A lot of people have work from home fatigue because they feel like they're spending every waking hour on a meeting on a Zoom. And that's because obviously a lot of the in-office collaboration that we had, it just doesn't exist anymore, right? For pop-ins and pop-bys. And so really thinking about how you want to start restructuring your meetings, whether it's agenda should be sent out 24 hours in advance, so that we're clear about what our objectives are and what our takeaways are, and we're making better use of our time. And so people aren't wearing themselves out by spinning their wheels, or just getting really clear about whether meetings need to happen and giving people time to do a little bit more deep work. That's a place where I'm really seeing people struggle with the fatigue, is an overscheduling of meetings, which, by the way, Terry, as you know, was an issue in a pre-coronavirus world, right?
Yes, it was.
To your question about, do I think work from home is here to stay? There's a woman I know, her name's Nikki Abramson. She is the founder of a company called Hustle Hunters. And what she does is she is a recruiter, and she specializes in working with people who want a flexible work schedule. And what Nikki said, and I think she's so right on this, is that she used to be the exception to the rule. Like, she was the woman who did flexible. There's no such thing, as Nikki says anymore, 9 to 5. Flexibility is here to stay. And so you see a lot of companies settling in from work from home for the long haul. And I think we'll definitely see that this is here to stay in some capacity. But Terry, you know, another thing that I'm seeing, and the Wall Street Journal had a great article on this about 6 weeks ago, is that people yearn for the office. You have restless singles. You have parents like me. I'm a mom of 2 under 4. I would kill to get out of the house to go to a quiet office all day. And as the Wall Street Journal article talked about, I'm not alone. And so I actually think you're going to see the landscape change. And you're actually going to, I think, see things only intensify. You're going to have people who never work from home another day in their life. And you're going to have people who never step foot in the office again. I don't know if it's a yes or no black and white paradigm so much as a true reimagining about what the office means to people and what collaboration and teamwork means to people.
That allows us to think very broadly about a number of different opportunities as business leaders and options. All right, I'm going to continue with our questions. How should companies modulate their internal communication in a COVID-19 world? What should be different?
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about this, and you know, it's so funny. I do a workshop for companies. First, it was called Thriving While Remote. Then it was called Surviving or Thriving While Remote. And now that we're like 3 going on 4 months in, it's now called Still Quarantine, Surviving or Thriving While Remote. And when I get to the section about leveling up your communication, it's like I can read the Zoom room, Terry, because we start to talk about how it's more important than ever to be clear and focused and directing your communication. And it's like you can actually watch people if you look really closely. Look at the attendance list, like I'm looking here and look at the list of people, and you see people's eyes kind of draw, like they're zeroing in on like, yeah, Terry, I hope she's paying attention to this. She really needs to clarify her communication. And the issue is that even in the best of times, oftentimes we think our communication is clear and direct. Right? Like nobody says, I pride myself on being an indirect and obtuse communicator. I pride myself on giving horrible directions, or I pride myself on managing expectations and deadlines and urgency horribly for my team. And so what I'm finding is that, you know, more than ever, you really need to level up about like what clarity looks like and what being direct looks like. And I can give you some specific examples, but I'll just give you a few case studies because I think it's really illustrative. So I'm sure many of you have read Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, or you're at least familiar with this case study, but Gladwell talks about it in depth in the book about how in the 90s, Korean Air had an abysmal safety rating. You know, Terry, planes were crashing and burning in a way that no other air carriers were having these issues in the developed world. And what they discovered was that it wasn't training, it wasn't the aircraft themselves, it was communication in the cockpit. Planes were literally crashing because the first officer was not being direct with the captain when he thought or she thought there was an error happening. They were so scared to manage up. And more importantly, as Gladwell talks about, there's actual, in Korean grammar, there are actual constructs that reflect hierarchy, which were a big issue. So everyone here is a senior leader. I really encourage you to think about, do you have a culture where it's okay to communicate up, where it's okay to manage up, where it's okay to ask when you say it's urgent or it's important, where it's okay to say back to you, what does that timeline look like? What do you need? So that's one piece of advice I would give you. In fact, I work with a C-level leader in a Fortune 500 company. And she came to me to our coaching session a few months ago, like really pre-coronavirus, Terry, perplexed. She didn't understand. She had set this directive at the beginning of the year. She really wanted to inspire her team to manage up to her. And nobody had come forward. And so I said to her, I was like, well, how'd you tell them to manage you up? And she's like, what do you mean? And what we discovered was, Terry, she had said it once in a team meeting that she wanted people to manage up. She didn't tell them how she wanted to receive the feedback. You know, was it in an email? Was it in the moment? Did she want them to call her? She didn't say how or, you know, when it was safe to do that. And as soon as she went back and what I call redesign the alliance with her team, she got the feedback coming. People were just scared to do it because they didn't have the guardrails. And so I encourage you to think about your team wants guardrails, right? That way they can have full autonomy within the guardrails. They don't want to be micromanaged every second. And so as you think about leveling up communication, do think about what your culture for communication is and how you can explicitly enfranchise your people and telling them when and how it's safe to manage up. And so I'll just pause there. Those are just a few examples, but really most people think they're being so clear, Terry, and we just see crossed wires. And in a world where we have work from home fatigue and burnout, it's like one bad conversation with one of you, the executive or senior leaders, that's enough to really throw their day into a tailspin in a way where perhaps that resilience, back to our point at the very beginning, that resilience is more important than ever. And we all really have to fight to be resilient right now and fight to be agile, because frankly, Terry, we're worn down. All of us are.
We are. And that's perfectly following on the next question. How do I achieve a balance between being a genuinely kind and compassionate leader, employer, during these stressful times for my employees, and at the same time, make sure that they accomplish our agreed upon work goals?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, there's really two sides to this coin, Terry. Regardless of whether you have your super high performer, high potential, ascendant, single employee who's living alone, who's restless, or you have your middle manager, working parent who's juggling, caring for children and getting them on Zoom lessons, or anything else. It's just the way that we all did work before. It just can't happen the same way. Now, I want to be crystal clear. Does that mean that companies cannot achieve their goals and extraordinary things right now? Absolutely not. Like that healthcare company I told you about earlier that I work with, the things that they have been able to accomplish and innovate in a COVID-19 world have been a decade in the making. And they're hitting things on their 2020, probably their 2022, 2025 strat plan in Q1, Q2 of 2020. That's profound. And really the key to this is resilience and agility. And so really understanding that part of our resilience, part of our ability to bounce back in moments of failure or struggle or faltering is to say, okay, resilience isn't trying to rerun the same play down the field the exact same way, right? It's about reimagining what it can look like. And so I encourage you to think about, what are the parts of my business that just don't feel like they're working? Some of them you're going to have less control over than others, right? So right now, maybe your sales organization isn't doing as great as you would like it to do, and it's really underneath your projections. Like one founder who I talked to a few weeks ago, her Q1 came in at 10% of what she projected it at. That was a tough conversation with her board. But her board also knows that, their business isn't operating in a vacuum. And so thinking about, Terry, as we think about being resilient and agile, reimagining what's doable, both in saying, what can we reach for that didn't actually feel like we could accomplish, but this moment's forcing us to innovate, and also reimagining and saying, okay, we understand that there are challenges in our marketplace from our buyers, from our staff, and thinking about, it's so easy to make people feel resourced and supported. One executive who I work with, she gave her working parents, like every week she sent them like a Lego kit, right? That was like a $20, not a $20, that was like a $5 per working family overhead cost that she had. So just again, thinking about how we reimagine. And also that goes back to communication, being super, super clear about the expectations that you have for people. So if people are faltering, I encourage you to think about, were we clear about the expectations? Were we being realistic about what's possible? Was this a performance issue or a strategy issue? And as you know, because you're all executives, really sitting down and asking yourself those questions. But I do think, again, it's a moment to innovate, to reimagine, and to be really realistic in being resilient and agile, and thinking about, what do we need to modulate and modify so that even if we're at 10% of our projections, and I hope that none of you have that, truly, that's an extreme example, that you're able to really recognize, and I encourage you as leaders to celebrate the wins, because people are tired and they want to hear that what they do matters. And they feel excited about the organizational goals, right? They want to carry that same weight and that same pride that you do, because many of them probably are aspiring executives just like you.
Great suggestions. Thank you. And I think you really addressed the next question, which is, how can leaders show their employees that they care? I think you gave some great examples. And is there something else you want to add, or shall we go on?
No, just the last thing that I would say is it's really profound to recognize people in ways that are meaningful to them. You know, the way that someone used to do something really great, and you would probably just, the next time you saw them in the lobby, in the elevator, you know, just say, hey, great job with that. Really finding ways to just show people. And I think this is on a really individualized basis. We've talked, Terry, about some of the organizational ways, like whether it's sending, like some of those folks I work with, you know, send the Uber Eats credits or the Legos, or, you know, just providing things like coaching to your people. Like that's a really, really easy fix. That's a lot cheaper than attrition, right? So bringing in speakers and workshop facilitators and coaches, it sounds expensive, but you know, an additional $15,000 spend on your Q2 professional development budget, it pays for itself if you keep one person. And even though we have mass unemployment, we're also actually seeing a rise in people voluntarily quitting. So it's actually a much more nuanced labor and employment marketplace and story.
So our next question is, with so many candidates in the market, how do we work not to be undervalued when hired?
I mean, Terry, I have thoughts on this, but this just feels like it's so in your bailiwick that I would actually kick it to you first.
Okay, I'll share some thought. I'll share some thoughts with you. But to set the stage, yes, we're seeing some resurgence. We also, as a snapshot for Los Angeles, we're also seeing some significant pressures in terms of unemployment, labor force shrinkage. Now we hope that that's going to resurge, but we're waiting to see that. So along some of the lines that you've already mentioned, and I will just reinforce them, there's several definitive steps that I recommend to both candidates and clients, and sometimes they end up being the same people. And those include: affirm your worth and value yourself on a regular basis. Smile. Have opportunities, find opportunities to laugh. I believe that that really helps with one's mindset, how one's presenting oneself. Use off time to hone and improve your skill sets. And it can be in anything, that from something that's very specifically career oriented to something completely not. I've always wanted to learn to play the saxophone because it all helps present you, make you, enable you to be a stronger, better person, both in your private world and in your professional world. Assume that at this economic climate, if you're hired, assume that your employee wants you. It helps, that mindset helps. Always keep your resume updated with specific quantifiable accomplishments. If your work is outward client-facing, note who may be a good resource for a recommendation or a referral in the future. And be ready to give 110% with that new job. This starts with clearly defined job description, which is discussed during the hiring process, during onboarding, and also let's make sure during that process as well that you've got a great mentor, someone like you, Randi, or someone else, also somebody in the organization that can give you regular and constructive feedback, and also remember to ask for it. Randi, you may have some other additional recommendations.
And Terry, I love what you said so much about laughing and using your brain for other things besides work. When I do my Thriving While Remote workshop, and when I do my workshop on practical self-care for executives, I talk about the 4 pillars of self-care. It's not just physical. It's not just like exercise, go for a run, drink water. It's about emotional self-care, which you hit on. It's about intellectual self-care. You know, by nature of the fact that you're a senior executive, probably pretty brilliant person, right? Pretty smart person. And sometimes we get so wrapped up in work that we forget to use our brains for other creative and intellectual pursuits. And then I always say spiritual self-care. So, you know, some people think that's a little woo-woo. It could be everything from a client of mine who misses going to her church. and just having the community there,
Yes.
to another really self-care skeptic client of mine who, quote, discovered meditation after years of calling it woo-woo. So, it's choose your own adventure on that. But, I just got this question. I was just facilitating for a Fortune 50 company last week, this Thriving While Remote workshop that I have for a cross section of their team. And one of the #1 questions that came up was actually about internal transitions. A lot of people in their organization at the beginning of the year or early in Q1 pivoted to new internal roles, and they feel a lot of pressure to show up and perform and be known entities and build the relationships. And that's a real challenge in a COVID-19 world. And so I'm encouraging them to think about, who do you want to be, right? How do you want to both do your best work and show people that you have some semblance of boundaries? How do you want to build relationships, whether it's Zoom coffee dates or raising your hand for things? Or, one of them was a working parent. She said, I feel like I just want to say yes to everything. And I said, right now she had 2 small kids. I said, you cannot do 100% of the work that you used to do when you had childcare. So do you want to do 80% of your normal work at 100% of your performance capacity? Or do you want to do 100% of your old work at 80% performance and be known as the person who gives 80%? And so there's paradigm shifts that we all have to take. And as leaders, it's not just for yourself, but again, thinking about people are looking to you to set the tone.
Yes.
And just the elephant in the room is that we are not in Kansas anymore, and there's lots of opportunity. We also need to be realistic about as leaders to understand what the challenges our employee populations have.
I think this is going to be the last question, and then I'm going to pause for just see if there's any other Q&A. And we're almost at, believe it or not, this has just been so dynamic. We're almost at the end of this hour. So how do we lead to instill resiliency in our employees and maintain that culture on an going forward basis so we don't lose what we're learning and gaining?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't have a crystal ball into the future. But what I can say is that if you're putting these processes in place now, you're going to build a lot of trust with your employees around the fact that you can weather the storm. And how you show up for them, how you react as an organization. Is there an element where people just have to weather, we're all in the storm weathering it together 100%, but like we talked about, Terry, at the top of the hour, it's a virtuous cycle. When people believe that you have control over the situation, hard in a moment where there's not a lot of control, and people believe that the organization has a plan, solid communication, transparent communication, you don't have to tell people you're resilient. They're living your resilience. They're experiencing your resilience. And what I'm really bullish on, I don't have a crystal ball, but I'm really hopeful that this is going to continue to inspire innovation. It's going to continue to allow us to humanize the work experience. And so that's what I'm looking forward to. And Terry, I'd be happy to show your folks, I have a plan, a game planning document that we talked about. And so I just want to show this all to you.
Sure.
If you all can see my screen. This is something I've worked with a lot of teams on, and they do this exercise. And so it's really all about, if you want to win the Super Bowl, you got to make a plan. And so really thinking about how you can segment out your professional, personal, and family lives. Think about what your needs are, your goals are, right? And then resilience is really thinking about what you're going to say yes to and no to allow those things to come to pass every single week. And the agility piece is knowing that because you had a plan, because you had a structure, it's easier to pivot when you have a plan than when you have to reinvent the wheel. And so I've used this document with a lot of teams that I work with, and they'll actually put it together, and at the beginning of the week, people will come and share their plans. And share, what they're going to say yes to, what they're going to say no to, what their needs and their goals are. It really opens up lines of communication. It aligns the teams. And again, this is agility, is to put together a plan, be willing to pivot, and come back and post-mortem it the next day.
Yeah.
So if you're interested in that, you can just screenshot my contact info here. You're welcome to email me, and I'm happy to share a document version of that with you all.
Thank you. That's really generous of you, and I appreciate it, Randi. And I'm sure my the attendees do as well. So let me now just check, and Randi, you check as well. Are there any questions? Let me see.
We got a great question from Matthew. And, you know, Matthew said, you know, this was earlier, they appreciate the advice of listening in the moment on racism. However, what is the advice about being direct and honest about the failures of the organization in the past? I'm a huge believer in the elephant in the room philosophy, which is, and this is about being honest without making your allyship performative. So it's actually a good thing to say. We have failed on this in the past. We're committed to making real sustainable change. As you can imagine, we cannot make sustainable lasting change within 7 days. Here are the steps that we're taking, and continuing to report back onto your people. There's been a lot of criticism of companies for early, what they call performative allyship, which is just like, oh, we got it. We're on top of this problem. We're solving this problem. You can't solve this problem in a day, a month, even a year. The companies that really do tackle this issue in a meaningful way are going to be in it for the long haul and going to be communicating with their folks throughout throughout that process. And again, I'm not the best in class subject matter expert on this, but I'm happy to connect any of you with colleagues who I think highly of in this space.
Thank you. And we had one other question there, and do you want to read it? Shall I read it out loud?
Hey, why don't you take it, Terry?
Sure. The mental strain which is currently being experienced may have the capacity to create a mental plateau where people are unable to see beyond the current scenario. Taking into account many people may be in a state of fragility, what are the human characteristics a leader should exhibit for themselves and their workforce to bring them forward?
Yeah, I was just talking about this with one of my clients, what's today, Wednesday, yesterday morning. And we were just talking about one of the things that's really helped her instill a lot of confidence and build a lot of trust in her team of 200 is just really leading with candor and vulnerability. And so I know that question came from Anthony. I'm not sure if this addresses your specific question, Anthony, but what I would say is what worked for her is really just showing up to her people. She does a weekly video message as well as a weekly email. And she's been really open and transparent in that video message of saying, like, it's hard. I know it's hard. Here's what's been hard for me. And just making her people feel like she's a person who's navigating the unknown too. I think people really want to hear from their leaders that they understand that this is hard. I think some of them a lot of leaders feel like they have to put on like a strong about face. And yes, please don't break down sobbing in the middle of a team meeting of 50 people. But there is something really powerful in terms of engendering trust and really just engendering this feeling of humanity and saying, like, I know it's tough and here's something that I struggled with. And really just being vulnerable and present and candid. The other thing I'll just say about this is really think about, creating space for conversation. So it's not your job to play therapist with people, but again, just really, really kind of engendering the human element of our work relationships.
So there's been such dynamic conversation and interesting back and forth that our hour is up. I want to thank you, Randi. This has been, I think, a really helpful session. You've really generously shared your time and expertise to address these critical issues, and they're very timely and important. And I think I've certainly learned a tremendous amount, and based on the feedback, the attendees have as well. Randi mentioned a few minutes ago that you can reach out to her directly, which thank you very much for that. And if you haven't noted her email address, oh, here we go again, then just, there you go. You can take it from there. You can also let me know and I'll be happy to send it to you. A recording of the webinar will be posted on my LINKCO account. LINKCO Executive Search provides elite companies with top CXOs and upper management cross industries nationwide using a proprietary step-by-step process for both clients and candidates. We are on 24/7, 365. I do try to take some breaks.
I was just going to say, Terry.
When you need help, please call upon us. Our next webinar is on June 24th with the fabulous Tom O'Brien. Stay tuned for additional topics and speakers, and the registration can be found on the website www.linkco.net and in the events section of my LinkedIn page. Randi Braun, thank you again. This has been amazing and helpful. Thank you all for joining us today. Have a good afternoon and a good evening.
Thanks, Terry.